Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation and your kind words. I had selected the topic of Reagan's expectations and the lessons, perhaps, from that first summit meeting, because I came across just recently in going through my papers, which I'm now trying to organize, a memo that was handed to me as we got on the plane at Andrews Air Force Base near Washington to fly to Geneva. And the National Security Advisor, Bud McFarland, said, "These are the President's thoughts about the meetings. We'll have an opportunity when we get to Geneva to brief him. If he's got something wrong, don't hesitate to tell him." So in a little over 4 pages, we have a memo which he wrote originally in his handwriting. It was typed up, and then some of what he had written in his handwriting was corrected by his hand. And I want to read a few excerpts from this because I think they not only tell us a lot about the man, about that meeting, but they have, I believe, resonance today, and that's the reason I put the lessons in there. He starts out by saying, "I believe Gorbachev is a highly intelligent leader, totally dedicated to traditional Soviet goals." Now, this is exactly what the CIA was telling him. Now, one of the things that some of the others on the staff and a minority in the CIA felt was he might be different. Let's push him a bit and find out. Let's not assume. However, at the point in Geneva, when he was going to Geneva, Reagan accepted this view. And I would say it was after meeting Gorbachev, he was much less inclined to it. And then he goes on, "He will be a formidable negotiator and will try to make Soviet foreign and military policy more effective. He is, as are all Soviet general secretaries, dependent on the Soviet communist hierarchy and will be out to prove to them his strength and dedication to Soviet traditional goals." So again, I would say don't concentrate so much on Soviet traditional goals as the fact that Reagan recognized that Gorbachev was not a dictator, that he had his own political problems at home. And this was one of the things. Now, he goes on to say he doesn't want to undertake any new adventures, but will be stubborn and tough about holding what he has. His major goal will continue to be weaning our European friends away from us. That means making us look like the threat to peace, while he appears to be a reasonable man of peace out to reduce tensions between us. But if he has to make a choice, then he will opt for demonstrating to his own hierarchy that he's a strong leader. Now, he goes on about several other things, but then I think in a very important passage, he says, "On another important subject for discussion and even negotiations, I'm sorry we are somewhat publicly on record about human rights." Well, we were not somewhat publicly on record. We were hugely on record about human rights. "Front page stories that we're banging away at them on their human rights abuses will get us some cheers from the bleachers, but it won't help those who are being abused. Indeed, it could wind up hurting them." And then he goes on and quotes President Nixon, who had talked to him about the immigration issue at the time and pointed out to him that we got much more on these issues when we were making progress on arms control and other things. And Reagan's conclusion from this was that we had to deal with human rights, not in public, but in private. And he and Schultz, from then on, did so largely. Now, he also expressed his belief in linkage in a general sense, sort of rhetorically. He says, "To those who believe arms control must be the goal as an end in itself with no connection to regional issues, Let us ask if SALT I in 1972 wasn't possible because the year before tensions in Central Europe were eased by the Berlin Agreement. Conversely, did SALT II fail of ratification on its own, or did the invasion of Afghanistan have something to do with it? This again was typical of Reagan's manner of thinking, sometimes indirectly about those, but also expressing the idea that we couldn't just concentrate on arms control. We had to do the whole broad agenda if even arms control was going to work. And then he goes on to say at one point that things like cultural exchanges agreements and consulates and things of that sort were important and desirable, but were not the central issues. He defined the central issues as security issues like arms control, regional issues of conflict, and the prevalent suspicion and hostility between us. In other words, he put up sort of building trust right at the same level as these regional issues and the arms control issues. And he then said, let us agree that this is the first of meetings to follow. That in itself will give an aura of progress. And he speculates a bit on that. And then he, in conclusion, says, but let there be no talk of winners or losers. Even if we think we won, to say so would set us back in view of their inherent inferiority complex. Now, obviously, several of these comments are highly relevant to things that are actually happening today. And I would point out, for example, that Reagan never debated publicly, you might say personally, the Soviet leaders. Yes, he condemned communism, but he never insulted them in public, even though they were often calling him a warmonger or worse. But he, again, understanding that you had to build a certain amount of trust before you could do the other things, I think was very much part of his thinking. In another passage, he states that one thing he wanted to get across to Gorbachev, see if I can find this, yes. So let me add here, another of our goals, probably stated to Gorbachev in private, should be that failure to come to a solid, verifiable arms control agreement will leave no alternative except an arms race, and there's no way we will allow them to win such a race. So here again, you have the roots of his thinking about his own arms buildup, which was not to have arms, to use them. As a matter of fact, he had ordered us not to seek superiority, knowing that there was no way that was going to be acceptable. But that at the same time, to make it clear that if they kept racing ahead, they were going to lose it. And of course, we learned from Chernyaev's memoirs that by 87, this is precisely what Gorbachev was telling the Politburo. I think he put it that their military-industrial complex is trying to force us into an arms race we cannot win. And comrades, we cannot let that happen. And that's when Gorbachev really, by 87, began talking seriously about unilateral reductions on the Soviet part. He also told the Politburo at that time that we can't even admit to our people how much we're spending until we get our level down to the American level. The idea that that ours was so much higher than theirs, again, it turned out to be different. So what were the achievements? I think that two achievements there stand out. There were others, but basically there was the personal achievement that they got to know each other, and although I think Gorbachev came back and described Reagan as a political dinosaur, Reagan came back. I suspect his own conclusion was different. I think he was trying to explain to his comrades why he didn't make more progress on arms control as they defined it. But certainly from Reagan's standpoint, in effect, he felt that MAGA Thatcher was right, that Gorbachev was a man he could do business with. And he began to see him as a human being, not just a tool of the Politburo, which he had been to talk about. Although they debated very, almost fiercely, SDI and certain other issues, the fact was that the two of them, I think, basically liked each other, almost despite themselves. And as far as Reagan was concerned, the agreement to meet two more times was important. But there was that personal element. But also the agreement that they made and signed in their joint statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must not be fought, which means there can be no war between us, was hugely important subsequently. For us it was important because it worded things much more clearly than the peaceful coexistence had been. After all, peaceful coexistence had been ideologically couched in peaceful coexistence between states with different social systems, leaving room for the Brezhnev Doctrine and other things. But the flat statement, there can be no war between us, turned out to be the keystone in much of our private diplomacy, particularly carried out by Schultz, who then would go to Moscow, sometimes with charts, showing what percentage we and the Soviets were spending on arms and how our economic growth was slowing, whereas the Germans were spending less than 1%, the Japanese less than 1%, and they were both at that time running circles around us in terms of economic growth. And Schultz would say, why are we doing this to ourselves? Obviously we're not going to fight, that's impossible. So let's get rid of these things. So I think that was very basic later. Now, as far as what Reagan had called window dressing, I think that these exchanges agreements and others that we signed in the long run played an enormous role in beginning to open up the Iron Curtain, because Gorbachev approved the breadth and depth of exchanges which had not been possible before. And as the years went by, because I think both sides put high priority on that, we actually named someone with the rank of ambassador to negotiate these agreements, as many as we could. And over the next 2 or 3 years, there was almost a sea change in the amount of contacts on both sides. So I would say that these were the achievements looking at this in the long run. But looking at it also, if we look at it from Reagan's eyes, then one of the most important ones was the agreement they made that Gorbachev would come to Washington the next year and Reagan to Moscow the year after. And it was in '86, it was Gorbachev's delay in setting those dates that actually encouraged a lot of the tension that developed and sort of culminated in Reykjavik, which was in many ways a failed effort to set things up for Gorbachev's visit to Washington, but ultimately turned out to be maybe the psychological turning point. Because after Reykjavik, I think both of them, although both were very annoyed, to put it mildly, at the end of the meeting, as we looked back on what had been achieved, it was apparent that both of the leaders were trying to achieve some radical reduction in arms, and we also realized on the Soviet side they were beginning to talk about these other issues that we had described as necessary in the agenda, that is, conflict in third areas, human rights, and bringing down the Iron Curtain, which we use the euphemism of building a better working relationship. So by Reykjavik, we sort of had that agenda on the table, the agenda that fulfilled sort of Reagan's generalized idea that you weren't able to do things with arms control alone. Now, what are the lessons? Well, I think I've already indicated some of them. One of the principal ones was we must not call it victory. And I think one of the biggest mistakes, not only factually, but politically, that we've made since the end of the Cold War is to talk about victory in the Cold War. We negotiated an end to the Cold War in the interest of everybody. There were no losers. And the idea that the Soviet Union broke up and that ended the Cold War is just wrong, in my opinion. The Cold War was over psychologically, diplomatically, at least 2 years before the Soviet Union broke up, which broke up almost entirely because of internal things. As a matter of fact, the United States and most of our allies were doing our best to help Gorbachev put together some sort of voluntary federation in '91. And we, as President Bush expressed in Kiev August 1st, '91, when he advised not only the Ukrainians but all of the non-Baltic republics to adhere to Gorbachev's Union Treaty, warning that independence and freedom are not synonymous, you should choose freedom, and also warning against suicidal nationalism. He was talking about Georgia at the time. He could be talking about Ukraine today. And then the triumphalism that came out of it, I think, lies at the basis of many of the mistakes that were made later. What he said about human rights, I think, is absolutely true. And the open espousal, particularly by the American legislature, Congress, of I would say, domestic matters in the Soviet Union, and a lot of the public criticism of domestic matters, I think, harms the very elements that we would like to help. I think that's something Ronald Reagan understood. So did George Shultz. It's something that obviously is not being observed today.